Welcome to the Healing Our Politics podcast, the show that shows you how to heal our politics by starting with the human in the mirror. My name is Skippy Mesereau, coach, former elected official, and lifetime public servant. It is my job to sit down with the best thought leaders, coaches, therapists, authors, scientists, and more, and to take the best of what they have learned and translate it specifically for the public service experience. Warning, this is a post-partisan space. No policy, party, or partisanship here because well-being belongs to all of us. This show is about resourcing you and trusting you to make up your own damn mind about what to do with it and what's best for your community. So, as always, with love, here we go. Welcome all to the Healing Our Politics podcast, the show that shows you, the heart-centered leader, how to heal our politics by starting with the human in the mirror. In today's episode, I sit down with public servant Japman Bajaj. Japman is a multi-hyphenate leader. He is literally the center of the Venn diagram between technology, policy, culture, and entrepreneurship. A VP at Vametric, he is reinventing hiring in public service to prioritize the human being. Japman is a published author, an accredited global shaper, a public speaker, and serves on more boards than one can count, including the Elected Leaders Collective. In this episode, we dig into growing up with a father in a national position of public service, the Sikh religion, if you are familiar or not, and how he was personally and communally impacted following 9/11, how faith and spirituality can influence service and improve well-being, his journey from the belief that policy was in the way to the way, how to balance the left and right brain functions for success, his meditation practice, and how you can use journaling to process trauma, loss, daily challenges, and so much more. I hope you enjoy this inspiring, diverse, and wide-ranging conversation with my friend, Japman Bajaj.
We're here.
We're here. Welcome to a brother, a board member, a friend, a fellow summiter, Japman Bajaj. Welcome to Healing Our Politics, the show that shows you, the heart-centered leader, how to heal our politics by starting with the human in the mirror.
I love that. Thanks for having me, Skippy. It's a joy, man. I've seen you start this. I've seen you grow it. I've seen you bring it to where it's at, and I'm excited to see you take it to where it's going to go. So it's a joy to be a part of.
Thanks, bro. Just to draw a little bit of connection, I just want to disclose that I have some frostbite on my left foot at this moment because I was very recently in your country, which is very far north and very cold. So I got a little bit of Canada with me.
Attaboy. Everybody should have a little bit of Canada with them. That's good.
The warmest temperature for the week was -17, and most of the week was -35 and under.
I'm guessing you were in Banff or somewhere around there?
Somewhere around there.
Yeah, excellent. Well done. Yeah, you came at the best possible time.
That is what I learned. So for people listening who are not familiar with Japman, he has a diverse background. And as I see it, and he may agree or disagree, we'll find out, really is the connective tissue in the Venn diagram between technology, entrepreneurship, policy, culture, and service, which I think is a really beautiful and interesting place to be. He is a lifelong learner and polymath, and he exemplifies in his work and my interactions with him a balance of left and right brain, sort of humans and system focused, that I don't come by often, and I really, really admire and look up to. And just as a short, partial list, when I say like polymath, multi-hyphenate, these are just a couple of the things that Japman's been into over the last, let's call it, decade and a bit. He was the manager at the Ottawa Innovation Community Challenge. He was an ambassador for leveraging global media and creating strategies for social change for leaders. He's a co-founder of Gen Y Ottawa, a managing director of the Soshal Group, Group digital agency, which was an award-winning agency, a curator at the Global Shapers community. He was an advisor at Calgary Arts Development, was on the board of the Trans-Canada Trail Project. You get the idea. Director of relations at Telcos, one of the largest conglomerates and communication companies in Canada, co-lead on WeView DEI podcast and media. It goes on and on. I literally have another 10 or so bullets, and this is just a piece of the pie. So looking at this kaleidoscope of things, what are you on this earth to do?
If you ask me that question on different times of my journey, it's different answers. But I think fundamentally, like, to better know myself. Like, I don't have control over too many other things. If I'm going to accomplish any one thing, it's going to be the accomplishment of actually figuring out what this whole thing is. Who am I? What am I? So I think, the bullet points, they're nice to hear. And then on the flip side, it's like bouncing around constantly, right? And I think that's just the way I'm wired. And I've learned for me that I learn more about myself through experience. And so constantly doing a number of different things a service to myself. Most of the time, if not all the time, they are anchored on things that are good for many, many people. But at the core, I'm doing them for myself to better learn about myself, to better understand myself. And if there's any one thing that I was here to do, if I were to be imagining what my deathbed looks like, and I'm lying there and sort of saying, yeah, that was a life well lived. I think a life well lived fundamentally starts with saying, I really understood myself. I have a deep self-realization experience that whatever number of years I end up getting on Earth, that gave me that self-realization experience. And part and parcel with that is, at least for me, that journey has been the more I learn about myself, the more I end up learning about others. And which is why most of the initiatives that I try to attach myself to and where I get a lot of fulfillment from are initiatives and experiences that involve trying to make other people's lives at least somewhat better in some capacity, some way.
It's interesting. I wonder, so I have a similar CV in its length and perceptible randomness. To me, it's never been random. For me, when I look at it, I see the connective tissue and I generally understand what the various options of next actions might be that would relate to a larger goal. And for me, that's always been public service. I see myself as a public servant first. So when you look at my resume, you might see runs a vacation rental company. That's weird. That's over there. Or did consulting for a ski club. That's weird, right? Like you could say, how do these things fit in? But for me, I was at the ski club because it was part of the community that I love and am invested in, and was a way for me to give back to not one or two, but 3 generations of people here and stay connected through an activity. I have a vacation rental company because that was and continues to be my greatest public service subsidy. It's the thing that pays the rent that allows me to be here and do those. So I get to see that connective tissue, but to a random passerby picking up the CV, they might not see that. And so I wonder, do you have an orientation to public service in that way? Or what might be a through line in your CV that would be clear to you, but not clear to others? And it may just be learning about yourself.
Yeah, so I pick up on a couple things. Like I try to be careful about, especially increasingly as I get older, making sure you're living your life for yourself, right? Make sure you're not living other people's lives. So, you know what? There's a part of me that says, look, if other people can't see the line of consistency through the things that you do, I don't know how much swearing is allowed on this podcast, but fuck it. Like, it's not for them. It's not their story. It's not their story. If they can't perceive how these things are connected, it's really nobody's problem. So the other thing is, though, that when you look back on things, the story often tells itself, right? Like, the story makes so much more sense in reverse than it does going forward. You take pretty much any major national or international event or crises, and you look at it and you go, that's not really random. You can sort of look back and say, oh, that's how we got here. You can do the same with people's individual careers and their career paths and their leadership journeys and things like that. The question then is also, the question is like, okay, well, how do you choose the next thing to do? And I'm deviating from your question a bit, but it really has to be the call from within, right? Like it has to be a call from within that compels you and says, yeah, this is in line with the things that you're supposed to be using your energy for. That call will only come to you if you're actually listening to yourself. And so when you talk about the thread, yes, there's a piece here where in my early 20s, I used to say yes to everything. In fact, that's still the advice I give a lot of younger folk. You know what? When you're in your especially early 20s, say yes to everything. Get your feet wet in a lot of different directions so that you know what resonates with you from a skills perspective, from a career perspective, from a soul perspective. Get your hands and feet and your mind wet in a lot of different ways. And then when you hit your 30s, you start finding yourself in a position where you get to say no to things because the opportunities come to you, because you've spread yourself out, you've spread your wings, you've shown the world what you're capable of in a lot of different directions. You can either keep saying yes to things, or you can start saying, you know what, I've got the 4 things I want to really focus on, or 2 things I want to focus on, and that's where I'm going to go. So then back to your question, the thread I think is like, it really just ends up being self-discovery. It really ends up being a combination of self-discovery, a healthy dose of opportunism, and service. I mean, service, I know that the experiences that have fueled my own self-realization journey the most have been service-oriented. You can pick apart any of the bullet points. The ones you chose in particular, I can pull back and sort of go, yep, that's why I did that. And because I thought I could bring value to a conversation that would impact many people. And again, for me, what I've learned is I have to be careful about that.
I love that, because when I look at you, I do see a servant or someone who's oriented to service. I also know that you would and do describe yourself with many other titles, entrepreneur, technologist, etc. I see that thread, but it's cool for me to know that you see that too, because I can also be guilty, like everyone, of looking for what is normal to me or what I orient towards. And what I'm super excited about over the course of this conversation is to unpack that journey of self-discovery, because as it is, frequently said, the unexamined life is a life not well lived. And in particular, for public servants who are under stress and overwhelm and public criticism, it can be the norm or the default to put that in a cabinet and say, that's for later. I don't have time for that. But in my experience, it is precisely because of the focus on self-development and self-knowledge that leaders are able to far more effectively serve. And so I think it's going to be really fun to kind of dive into that journey with you and just learn where you've been. And people can, take what's interesting to them or not,
2023 was a year where I evaluated whether or not I should, and when you use the word public servant, I think we could talk about the bureaucratic public servant, but there's the elected official, the one who's constantly in the spotlight, the one who's constantly being sort of bombarded with media, this and photo op that, and opening events and all those types of things. The very public leaders in the political system. 2023 I took as an opportunity to ask myself whether or not that was a life I wanted to pursue, a life of elected politics. And gratefully, I have dozens of people who have served and who have been very close to those who have served, and whether they were spouses or they worked as staffers, whatever. The ones ultimately that I think that we end up admiring the most, I'll say I end up admiring the most, are the ones who equally knew when to call it quits as it was to get in there. Because again, to your point, there is a sense of self-awareness of like, what am I here for? What are my values and strengths? I think when you don't know those things, you end up, whether by design or by accident, you end up becoming one of those elected officials that seemingly just can't give up their chair because it's all they've ever known, and they can't imagine what they would do outside of politics. And then, you start thinking about the power and the money and the sort of toxicity that comes with some folks who are literally just doing the job because they couldn't possibly fathom themselves doing anything else. And you get a lot of toxicity when you don't. This is true for every discipline and every type of person. If you don't know yourself, you're setting yourself up for quite a bit of failure.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think a lot of people haven't taken the time to listen to what I like to call your little voice. What's your little voice actually saying?
So let's go back in the timeline. And you even talked about, envisioning your last day on this planet. But let's go back to before there were stories written, before you had the inclination or were being trained to live someone else's story or someone else's life. And take us back to kind of day one for you. Like where do you come from? Where did you grow up? What was your family experience like?
Yeah, my folks moved to Canada in 1968, well before I was born. So if this was present day, my dad would have been born in what currently is known as Pakistan, but was pre-partition days, so it was all India at the time. So ironically, if partition had never happened, I wonder if we would have ever moved to Canada, but that's neither here nor there. Came to Canada in 68. My mom came from Singapore. She was born in India, but her family moved to Singapore when she was pretty young.
So in modern day Pakistan, previous India, but this was before the border switched, before the war and conflict. What inspired him to leave?
Oh, he was 1 year old. It was partition that inspired him. So when the colonizers left the imaginary line that got drawn between Pakistan and India, he was 18 kilometers on, quote unquote, the wrong side. And they had to walk. So it was him, his older sister, who was 2 years older than him at the time. So a 1 year old and a 3 year old and their parents. Wow. Although he, honestly, he admits that he doesn't actually remember anything from it. He has a lot of stories from, the 11 days or 9 days it took them to actually cross, because there was soldiers everywhere. There was military everywhere. They were hiding in ditches for hours at a time just to make sure they didn't get shot at.
Anyone who's listening who doesn't know the history, this is like one of the greatest and fastest mutual mass migrations in human history, where individuals of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but primarily Muslim descent who were on the India side had to flee to Pakistan, and those of, I guess, primarily Hindu descent or Buddhist descent, there's Tibetan Buddhism up in like that area as well, fled south to India. And the violence was severe, and it continues to be one of the most militarized places in the world.
Yes, and in Punjab in particular, it would have been Sikhs, which is who I am. I come from a Sikh family. And so before the colonizers came, it was a history lesson for everybody. Prior to the colonization by the British, there were simply just a series of emperors who ruled over the area, most of them coming from the subcontinent. And the most recent empire was the Sikh Empire. Fantastic stories from the Sikh Empire in terms of like the freedom of religion, the actually Judaism's presence in the Indian subcontinent only happened because the Sikh Empire actually allowed it in, first of all, and then secondly, created safe spaces and communities for Judaism to be practiced safely in pockets all around India, and Judaism is still there to this day.
So I was going to wait a little bit later to get into this, but let's do it because I'm super interested in this. I learned a very small amount, a great number of years ago when I was in this region about the Sikh religion, which I knew pretty much nothing about. My memory is very hazy. This was like 2013, I think. I was on a trip in primarily northern India, but sort of all around the border regions. So can you outline a little bit of the Sikh traditions and belief structures? It doesn't have to be super long, but just to familiarize people who are like, I don't even know what that word means.
Sure. Okay, so we'll start literal. The literal translation of the word Sikh is learner. And you can extend that to seeker. You can extend that to explorer. You can extend that to... But the idea is somebody who is constantly on a learning journey. So that's sort of the literal translation. Philosophy-wise, there's so many things I could share. I'll share one or two. The entire book of scriptures, which we actually sort of revere as our prophet to this day, if you will. Prophet's the wrong word, but it's an English word that we'll use. That scripture is 1,430 pages long, but the first word is the number one. And the number one signifies oftentimes people will say that Sikh, so in English words we'll say Sikhism. The word is Sikhi. Sikhi is a way of life. Sikhism is a Western word, but Sikhi is a way of life. The first word of the scripture, the number one, generally implies this idea of oneness of all living beings, of all creation. So generally people will say, oh, Sikhi is a monotheistic religion. They believe in one God. That's not untrue. The problem with the statement is that it's a monotheistic religion, except that you are a proportion of that one God, and the mountains are a proportion of that one God, and the trees are a proportion of that one God. And so that monotheism is a little bit blended into a pantheism, in that God is of everything and in everything and also between everything. And so there's nothing less divine about you than there is some magical man in the sky figure who may or may not exist.
So this development of self was really gifted to you.
Yeah, I was cursed with it. The other key thing I might share, in skipping hundreds of years of spiritual learnings, is the notion of saint soldier. In Punjabi, this is the Sant Sipahi. And so the idea is that Sikhs pursue a lifestyle of both saintliness and soldierness. And there is a priority. It's the saint soldier. It's not the soldier saint. It is the saint soldier. The saint has to be first and foremost. The soldier must always be ready. There's a real effort and focus on discovering your inner warrior. That could be the warrior of the pen. That could be the warrior of the sword. That could be the warrior of whatever. But the ability to stand up for yourself, and equally as importantly for those who are underprivileged, underrepresented, who are abused, assaulted, or oppressed, whatever that word is. So that's the other key tenet I think that I would share with the audience here is those are the key ones, right? The oneness, the idea that we are all one and of the same, which then really actually fundamentally and obviously translates into this idea of saintliness and soldierness, the saint soldier. Again, the soldier being there to ultimately protect not just oneself, but all those who might be oppressed.
And if my memory serves, there are a few core practices, well, not practices, but behaviors and or like physical things that a Sikh will do. So, for example, what is the name for what you wear on your head?
The English word that is acceptable is turban.
Okay.
I use the Punjabi word is dastar, and we can dive into a little bit of the philosophy of it. It's a crown. It's meant to be seen as a crown. To put this in context, only emperors and their closest entourage were allowed to wear turbans. And when the Sikh faith was established, our spiritual leaders, our gurus, just basically said, that's a little bit of horseshit. Like, why are you so special? We're all going to wear turbans. So we all wear turbans. Now, there's a lot of practicalities. There's a bit of a social justice piece there, right? There's a sort of, screw you, we're going to do it. Nothing special about you. That's not special about this homeless person. We're all going to wear turbans. The other thing is that part of the equation here is we don't cut our hair. Right. Many Sikhs do cut their hair. It doesn't make them bad Sikhs.
Sure. There's a gradation of following like every religion.
Correct. And so when you keep your hair, you have to be mindful of context. You go back into those days of the 14s and 15s and 1600s, we're talking about, India, there's dust, there's dirt, there's whatever. You're often working in the farms. If you're keeping long hair, you probably need a system to keep it hygienic, to keep it in control, to keep it orderly. And so now a turban makes a lot of practical sense. And then the long unshorn hair has been studied by Buddhists, it's been studied by Hindus, it's certainly been studied by Sikhs. The idea that it can be a gift from God, it can have significant benefits to your own spiritual mindset. Some of those studies on MRIs of people who keep long unshorn hair when they meditate versus those who don't, like it's really fun you can sort of see some of the science catching up to some of the ancient wisdom. So we keep our long hair, we keep it uncut, we keep it covered. We keep it covered, A, because it's practical, but B, because also it's a bit of a screw you, I'm here. And it's interesting because as we talk about politics, policy, and those types of things, when you look as different as I do, and as many people do in their own way, your life becomes political whether you want it to or not. That was a lesson I don't think I really learned until the last 5 or 7 years, which is I always considered myself politically apathetic, that I didn't really particularly care. Ironically, that was just how I saw it. The fact of the matter was that by virtue of just being the way I am was a political statement in and of itself.
Well, I mean, I remember very sadly after 9/11 when violence against Muslims upticked, there was a particular likelihood of being randomly murdered if you were Sikh, because there was a misassociation of an obviously visible person with a turban on. And so people would, walk into a job site and just shoot someone and not recognize that they were not Muslim, but that this religion, this tradition in many ways, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there are a number of tenets or elements in it that kind of, like you said, that warrior, that fuck you, that were really stood up in the face of, maybe some of the things that were less lauded about Islam or some of the other religions in the region at the time.
There's so much about that time frame that is like so interesting from a Sikh and a Muslim experience. So first off, let's just say, no random innocent stranger should have been murdered in the streets. Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Christian, whatever. And one of the things I'm very proud about my fellow Sikhs who have spoken out about this, which is the question should not be, oh, we got it wrong, we thought we were hurting a Muslim. The question should be why are you trying to hurt anybody to begin with? What is your what here? I will say that what was really interesting about that time is, naturally you looked on TV and you saw the pictures of the Osama bin Ladens and the whatever. And when you looked at the pictures of the 19 terrorists who actually committed the atrocity, none of them were turban wearers.
Mm-hmm.
And the statistics for hate crimes against Sikhs for, I want to say it was up to 6 years following 2001, 9/11, was higher than any other group. Whether it was Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Christians, whatever. The hate crimes committed against Sikhs were statistically and absolutely, not just on a proportion, there were more hate crimes.
It had literally nothing to do with what the people were angry about.
Correct. Which is wild. So, it's part and parcel. It becomes part of when you start folding in identities of okay, well, hold on. There's a oneness piece. There's a saint soldier piece. There's all sorts of stuff that I could go on a diatribe about who Sikhs are. And you fold it into there's all this external, this is how the world is perceiving. And it's not even the world. This is how a couple of nut jobs are perceiving us. And how do we navigate that with country or countries, let's call it Canada and the US and the UK and some of these other places where we've established ourselves quite nicely. You start asking yourself well, how are the ways in which we can keep ourselves safe? Because we already left one partition-ridden state with the political unrest that happens in India. We've already come from there to come to this place to live freely, safely, build ourselves and build our communities and our families. To every end, I think many minority communities, especially those from the Indian subcontinent, have done this very well, which is they've started establishing institutions in North America. And again, linking this back to what you're talking about and what the importance of the work that you're doing is that you need that soulfulness when you're building communities up, because most communities that are contemplating how they further advance their agenda in a nation state like the US or Canada, they're coming from trauma.
Yeah.
Which is the story for a lot of people fucking all across the board. A lot of people bring their trauma to their politics. They bring their trauma 100%. To their lives. And whether that's, Skippy Mesero, former city councilor in Aspen, or, minister of XYZ who happens to be a Muslim woman or whatever, we're all bringing our traumas. And so when those traumas are being sort of set out, lived out, and created in real time, if you don't have that strong rooted sense of listening to your own self, again, it just comes back to this idea of you have to really know who you are. You have to really have a good sense of what do you stand for? What are your values and principles? Because otherwise you go down the path of toxicity so fast, so fast. And I think 9/11, coming out of 9/11, the Sikh community, I would say, has done an enormously a great job.
You were also a freshman in high school then?
I was a sophomore.
Very impressionable time and moment. I have a question. It's not a non sequitur, but it's a little off base. Are Sikh communities that have immigrated to Western countries, Canada, America, are they disproportionately successful?
Great question. So, like every community, there is a continuum.
Sure.
The newer, I'm going to call it, so I'll say in the Canadian context, we have a lot of recent immigrants to Canada, and I'm guessing it's true in the US too, and they largely take the form of international students, and they're struggling, right? There's a very real, and look, I mean, the Canadian political dialogue on this topic is nuanced. To use a diplomatic word, it's nuanced. Canada's made some choices to like absolutely, exponentially increase the number of immigrants we've been taking in, largely from Punjab. Like there's a lot of Punjabi immigrants who look like me who have come to this country in the last 3 years.
On my trip, the first person that I met was from like Srinagar area, just outside. And we had a great conversation. He's like, You're on a motorcycle trip in my hometown? I was like, yes, I was. I just have to say this because this is the craziest story. So this man had no intention to immigrate to Canada, was living his life in a suburb just outside of Srinagar, basically, in Kashmir, and meets a Canadian woman randomly at a popsicle stand where he's just hanging out. He's a teacher. He's like there with all of his kids. He meets her. They strike up a conversation. They decide they're going to get together. He doesn't tell her that he lives in a town that's a little bit far away and he doesn't have a car. It's going to be hard to get there. But he like makes a solid effort. And I think he said over the 4 weeks he was there, they had like 6 in-person meetings. I don't know what you call them, dates, whatever. And then they talk on the phone every day for like 6 years, but never see each other. And he proposes on the phone, moves to Canada, and they've got 5 kids.
Come on. That's a beautiful story.
Isn't that amazing?
That's off the charts cool. That is a great story. I love that. I mean, and this is the thing is like, to your question, that's a success story. I don't know how well he does financially, but that's success right there. Are people in the Sikh community broadly successful using financial metrics?
Yeah.
Like, yes, there's a lot of entrepreneurialism. There's a lot of like, get shit done attitudes. And when you've seen events like partition.
The reason I'm asking is like, I come from a Jewish tradition and I have really fought that in many ways in myself and in my upbringing. And I want to talk about how your faith tradition has influenced your upbringing and, comes into high school, and we'll get there. I've really struggled with it, but I read a book a good number of years ago. I think it was called The Triple Threat, and it looked at disproportionately successful communities. So Jewish Americans were one of them. Iranian Americans were one of them. There's Cuban Americans in Florida, a number of them. And there were kind of 3 overlapping characteristics that defined all of them. And they were, 1, a intense focus on education. 2, a strong held and historical belief in your specialness, which, I heard the first in your CV and in your experience. I heard the second in we wear a turban because fuck you, we all get to wear a turban. And then the third is the ongoing fear of persecution. And it's like this collage of both feeling self-important, for lack of a better term, doing the work of educating, but also having something to fear as a motivator. And I believe I remember that one of the things that Sikh will carry is a knife of some kind, and that strikes to the warrior. It just struck me of like, is this fitting that mold? Do we have an experience to share or talk about?
Absolutely, it does. And look, that's where sort of I was going. When you come from the trauma, right? When you come from partition, you come from the political unrest, and that's putting it mildly in 1984, where effectively it was a genocide of Sikhs. Pretty much every institution in the world that documents the definition of genocide agrees this was genocide. India is one of the only places that doesn't agree, largely because it was committed.
Can't imagine why.
I know. So when you've been through that, you can imagine that the "I'm not going back there" fear, or it's both a chip on your shoulder as well as like I've seen way worse. This inflation ain't gonna hurt me. Look at what I came from. Like there's a certain spirit. And when you were listing out the communities, I got to go to Israel and Palestine in 2023, and I saw so many parallels in both communities with the Sikh community, and it warmed me because it was like, we really are just the same. And that is a highly oversimplification of obviously what's like happening in the Middle East right now, and it's too bad because we're so much more alike than we are different.
Yeah, and we're seeing a like response as well. Most U.S. Jews do not wear physical indicators anymore, but many do. When they do, they become targets, and as if all Jews, regardless of their degree of piety on every continent, share culpability with the decision of a particular leader in a particular country in a very particular set of events is like insane.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? You're touching on that piece. One of the things that really struck me is a shared reality between Judaism and Sikh. There is really a continuum, right?
Yes.
Like there is the secular Jew or the atheist Jew.
I think it's over a third of self-identified Jews in the US are atheists. It's like, makes sense of that. And it makes sense to me.
Yeah,
but.
yeah. It totally. And now that I've been there and experienced it, it makes total sense to me too. And I realized, holy smokes, like we're kind of not entirely different that way. I mean, when you peel back this idea of God is like, again, man in the sky, living in the clouds, looking down upon us and judging us, right? Like when you look at that, it's like, that's a really linear sort of like, I know how to be an atheist in that context. And there's a lot of that sort of Western influence, I'll call it Western influence in Sikh over the last 120 some years. But like some of the root definitions of what is divinity, when you start talking about like, look, this woman sitting next to me is part of the divine, and you and I are part of the divine, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, well, how do I not believe in that? And so, but this idea that you might not believe in man in the sky God, right? And classifying that as atheism, but also still being Sikh is like a very real thing. Like that makes total sense. So now and it was actually the trip to Israel that helped me understand that like actually being secular and belonging to a faith group are not different things.
My partner, my girlfriend, Jamie, comes from Oklahoma, Christian, it's typical US as you're going to get. Somehow she's decided she wants to start reading Kabbalah, which is like Jewish mysticism, which, half the Jews that I know would roll their eyes at. And what I remember is after her first day of reading, she came to me with like eyes wide being like, we're all God.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's right there. And I find that to be beautiful. And I'll out myself. I identify as Jewish for sure. I went to a bilingual day school for, 9 years where half my day was in Hebrew. But I never say never, but I'd be very surprised to find I ever become a deist like that. But the tradition, like you said, with the chip, after everything that we've been through, I couldn't disidentify or abandon that community. And as much as that community has given me, has passed along a lot of those traumas and neuroses and anxieties and those things, it has also given me the absolute gifts of education and mindset and perspective that have allowed me to transmute those negatives into positives in the self-development journey. There's a word I came across when doing some research here. I'm going to mispronounce it, I'm sure, but is it langar? Is that how you say it?
Mm-hmm. Langar, yeah.
Yeah. And I wondered about, so for me, I think the equivalent in Judaism is tikkun olam. I'm not sure if you would see those as pairs, but tikkun olam basically means to repair the world. And so it is the belief and practice of giving back universally and leaving the world better than you found it. One of my favorite quotes, which I'm going to butcher, is, "It is not my responsibility to finish the job, but neither can I desist from doing my part." Yeah, that's a long, it's a long bridge tie, but I'm really curious, like, how does this faith tradition show up on day one? How does it influence, little Japman? And start to walk us through, like.
Yeah, so in every way, right? There are a few different words that strike me as resembling. So Langar, just for the listener, the institution of Langar, it's effectively the free kitchen. So if you attend, if you visit, whether as a Sikh or a non-Sikh, whoever you are, you show up to a gurdwara, a Sikh place of worship, you get a meal. And you sit on the floor, and everybody sits on the floor. I don't care if you're a millionaire or the poorest dude on the block. You're sitting on the floor together, side by side. You're eating together. You're eating the same food, right? You're not, you're all participating. Again, sort of this idea of equality, equity. We're all the same. Doesn't really matter what your wealth or success in a social context is. In the eyes of the Lord, you're, in the eyes of the divine, you're the same, right? In the eyes of humanity, you're all the same. So that's the Langar piece. The notion of seva. Seva is like service. Seva is loosely translated to service, but it really is this concept of like a selflessness, a selfless service to benefit, kind of like the campfire rule that you sort of said, look, I leave something better than it was when you found it. Again, interlinking with the saint soldier piece from before, like to offer your service to those who actually really need it and to find ways to uplift whoever you possibly can through the act of seva. So how did it influence like little Japman? So I grew up in a spiritual community within the Sikh faith, and I feel very lucky because in a lot of ways I was taught sort of these sort of more mystical interpretations of Sikhi from a young age. And like in every community, not every community is like that. So there's a lot of doctrine-based communities, do the thing or else, or do the thing because, God will be mad if you don't, right? So luckily I didn't grow up with any of those sort of like guilt-based relationships to spirituality, to religion, to faith, to divinity, which I think has also been why I've been able to foster, I think, a loving relationship with it as I've gotten older, because it's not like the ideas of atheism. I sometimes jokingly say I'm the most atheist religious guy you'll ever meet because there's a lot of aspects of institutionalized religion that I'm just sort of not convinced on. And I think part of the way that can all live together is because I was brought up in a way to view faith from a more mystical perspective by default. And so it was a part of my upbringing every day. We would sit together, we would talk about ideas, spiritual ideas as kids, and like with my two older sisters and my parents. And I learned scripture from a young age and singing kirtan. Kirtan is like the singing of hymns in a religious context. These are effectively, they're spiritual songs from our scriptures, but I like to think about them as love letters. They're effectively love letters between a soul and the pureness of like pure soul, right? Like love letters between a person navigating their way back to their soul. And so I grew up singing that. I still sing to this day. I play instruments that are typically used in a religious setting. I also now play them outside of religious settings. Honestly, there's very little in terms of parts of my life that are not directly and almost absolutely influenced by my faith.
When you say that you rejected some of the more doctrinal things, what would be an example of that?
Really, it comes down to so much around institutions attempt to assert control. Again, we're talking about politics. We're talking about the same things that we would identify in political systems in our general, broader demographics. We're talking about institutions that are meant to be faith-based institutions, but for some reason, policing how you live aspects of your life where there's really no room for them to have that voice, right? Using, call it the church, to then also exert control and power over people's lives outside of the church, so to speak. The same is true, I think most institutionalized religions struggle with this sort of relationship.
Yeah, so your rebellion is not against necessarily the practices or beliefs that are in the doctrine. It is against the way that they are leveraged within the human condition.
My take on doctrine is, again, because I was fortunate enough to grow up in a non-guilt-based relationship with God, I don't fathom a divine entity, should there be an external divine entity. I just don't fathom one that's sort of like, unless if you don't do that, I'll be upset with you. It's like it doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't line up for me. So somebody who wears an even larger turban or wears whatever is like extremely doctrine oriented is also beautiful. It's so beautiful. Especially particularly if it's coming from a place of love. Like if it's an inspired act, I'm all for it. I don't care.
Is that a thing? The size of the turban correlates to the degree of the piety?
No, it's not. I'm using it as sort of an easy physical distinguisher for our conversation. Okay. Thank you for asking that. It's a good clarifier. It's not. It's just to say that the doctrine piece of it, I struggle with it when it's fear-based, when it's guilt-based. And I feel like oftentimes institutions are those who push that you have to do this because, or else, or if not, then. Whereas when it's something that's self-inspired or inspired from your community, or it's again, love-based, not dissimilar to the work that you're trying to do, right? We're trying to inspire this like love, right? If it's love-based, I don't care how you do it. It's really not for me to care about anyways. It's not my place to pass that judgment in a faith context. But for me, the institutionalization of things, when I talk about sort of my critique of it, it's like, why do you care how I spend my money? Why do you care how I, do any sort of number of things in my personal life that actually are outside of your scope of control? And so that's where I sort of knock on institutionalized faith. It's the institutions and the the people who run those institutions, who once they occupy power, sometimes extend that power beyond what they should. And then again, this is like entirely parallel to American politics, Canadian politics.
Or just human systems.
Human systems, 100%.
How do mom and dad, in addition to the faith tradition, imprint on you? You talked about breaking out of living other people's stories. And so I'm wondering what stories, good or bad, helpful or harmful, did you learn from mom and dad early on?
Yeah, I always say I feel like I hit the parent jackpot. Like I have the best parents, and they're not without fault, but they're amazing. They're honest, they're kind, they're well-intentioned, they've got amazing hearts, and they make mistakes like we all do. And so what are the things that I've learned from them in a positive sense? My mom is the closest thing I've met to somebody who understands universal love, like who just knows to start from a place of love at all times. And sometimes that's like the most magical thing, and other times it's like, Mom, are you kidding me? And for my pops, he was a lifelong public servant, and his work has, frankly, it's built very important parts of this country. Like in Canada, he ended up becoming a pretty senior public servant, bureaucrat, and his work has really molded a lot of what Canada is becoming. And so the example of sort of you can do big things, right, sort of lives in my house in that regard.
What are some of the projects that he worked on?
Canada's relationship with its Indigenous people is a fractured one.
Yes.
A lot of systemic discrimination, racism. There's a really great quote by a senator, Canada's first Indigenous senator. And the Senate in Canada is very different from the Senate in the U.S. But nonetheless, this senator, Marie Sinclair, made the comment, systemic racism is what happens when you remove all the racists from a system. And in effect, my dad's sort of life's work had been trying to unpack some of the things that the Constitution had baked in that were actually systemically discriminatory towards Indigenous communities. And one of the key things around that is fiscal policy and how northern communities and Indigenous communities could self-govern in the context of a country. And so he dealt with a lot of land claims. He dealt with a lot of the fiscal policy on how money can and should flow with good governance to minimize corruption, to ensure that people were winning across the board from across, not just, so in other words, not just like elected band officials or whatever, like just making sure that there was transparent fiscal and economic pathways for Indigenous communities to thrive. We had a big announcement this week, work that my dad started but retired and didn't finish, but he started this work where we have 3 territories in Canada. One of them is called Nunavut, and Nunavut is largely home to Inuit people. And this week, they signed an agreement that, again, my dad started to give them some self-determination over their own budgets, because up until now they were effectively treated as wards of the state, if you will, as a territory. And so they actually didn't have full control over their own budgetary process. It had to sort of go through, it's far more nuanced than that, but at its high level, it's this idea of self-determination that now the territory of Nunavut, largely Inuit population, can now actually make decisions for and by themselves, of themselves, that can help propel them into their own destined future.
I don't want to get into the policy, but just because I can't help my curiosity, is it not the case that, well, I guess, do the other 2 territories have until recently had different budgetary ability?
No, so my dad's work was across all the North, so all 3 territories now have that status. My dad was there to see and finish and witness and complete the first 2 territories. He was only there to start and sort of push the ball forward on the 3rd one before he retired. And so he just wasn't there to see it to its completion. But all territories, as by virtue of being territories, so in Canada,
as opposed to provinces.
Correct. Yeah. So provinces are constitutionally protected, and they are their own entities, and in fact, confederation, to some degree, like the United States. It's an agreement that all provinces will participate in this confederation.
So Alberta and British Columbia have control over their own budgets in the same way that Alabama and Illinois did, but the territories did not in the same way that, and this is not what's going on, but if Guam, for instance, was budgeted by the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. Without getting into the details of the nuances of the policy, there are certain things that are federally mandated. There are things
Yes.
that are then provincially mandated. So education and healthcare, right? They're delivered at the provincial level. Healthcare is funded at the national level,
Yep.
et cetera, et cetera. Like, so it's yeah.
So how old are you when you first really become aware of what your dad is doing? Do you remember?
Oh, like shamefully late, shamefully old when I come to think about it. Like when I joined the board of the Trans-Canada Trail, I think was one of the first times where I was like, holy shit, I get to nation build this country. This is what my dad's been doing for 40 years,
Wow.
right? Like it's such a small microcosm, the work that I was able to do on the trail compared to what he's done for the
So
country.
you knew his title, but you didn't really understand the gravity of what he was doing.
And the gravity might not have happened till 2023. Like I got to go to
Wow.
Yukon and witness what was happening in many communities in the Yukon, and they were talking about this agreement, the federal transfer agreement, which was a huge part of what my dad worked on, and how it was revolutionizing the way that they were able to make decisions as a First Nations community and then as a territory. And because I'd never been up north, and I certainly hadn't talked to many people up north, I wasn't aware of, like, again, to your word, the gravity of the work that had been done until last year. I knew that he won the highest award possible in the public service in Canada for the work that he did. I saw it as an award.
So when you were younger, was your life affected by his role in any way? Or if someone had asked you in, fourth grade, what's dad do? You're like, I works for the government.
He works for the government. Well, my dad, very humble, right? Like extraordinarily humble. Like there was a few different occasions where he has had colleagues who've wanted to nominate him for what we call the Order of Canada. It's the highest civilian honor for his work that he's done in North. And he abjectly refuses to be nominated. He just is not interested in that type of limelight or that type of recognition. It's just not how he's wired. So there's a high sense of humility. This can either be a good thing or a bad thing. Back to your question, what are the goods and the bads? That, humility is a beautiful thing. Excessive humility, sometimes I think maybe in the world we live in today, can be harmful in some ways. But he was very humble about it. So yeah, my dad worked for the government. That's what I used to say. And frankly, like seeing the gravity of what he was able to work on and how it's contributed to this amazing country is I think I'm still unpacking.
So you're kind of imbued with this sense of love and openness and exploration. You are soaking in service, even if you're not really, fully grasping or contextualizing what it means. How does this present in you as like middle school, high school, college version of you? Like, how would you describe yourself?
So I was I was heavily bullied as a kid. So I actually, until high school, I can tell you I had one friend every year, and it was not often it was the same friend. So at the schoolyard, like at the playground, at school, at recess and all that, pretty lonely kid. And it bred a lot of, I was a chicken shit. Like I was a chicken kid, right? Like I didn't have a lot of courage. I didn't have a lot of feistiness in me. I was constantly doing the fight that a lot of kids fight, right? Just trying to fit in. I often just got bullied because of the way I looked. I was the one brown kid, certainly the one turbaned kid on the playground. And that was always an easy target. Having my turban as a kid, my little turban ripped off by other kids and things like that. So I was not the most popular kid in going from elementary school into middle. But when I got to high school, things started changing, and I started seeing more people that looked like me. And I remember sort of thinking, where did you people come from? Where were you all?
Is that because it was a feeder high school and there was other districts coming in?
That's right, exactly. So just a lot of different schools came into that elementary schools came into that high school, and there were so many more Punjabi kids. Not necessarily many who looked like me, but there was just more brown kids. And we found each other. We sort of there's a safety in numbers piece. I think many of us had come from schools where we were the one of 5 kids or one of 10 kids, but all of a sudden there was 100 of us in one place. And it's like, whoa, this is kind of interesting. And that started some of the more institutional pursuits. Like I wanted to be on students council. I was grade 9 rep, right? My first year in high school, I've just found confidence because I had friends. I don't know if there's any single answer to that question, but for the first time outside of my spiritual community, I found community in a way that felt really positive.
Do you remember what you quote unquote ran on, or what some of your accomplishments were on that group?
I don't even recall, man. Grade 9.
Okay.
I don't even remember. I don't remember. I'd be lying if I remembered. I ended up running the multicultural club after that. I ran for student council president in my junior year. Didn't win, but that's okay. Ended up finishing out. I think I was grade 12 rep as well. So how did all this sort of show up to your question? Like, how did this all show up? Like, not perfectly. I mean, as a kid who was constantly without friends at school, there was a lot of loneliness, and there was a lot of there's a lot of tears, right? There's a lot of just sadness that I couldn't be a part of friend groups. And I think one of the really interesting things was, I remember asking my mom, I never asked her, can I cut my hair, for example? Like, that question, for whatever reason, never crossed my mind. It would have been the easy out, right? But for whatever reason, the question I just kept on asking is why can't they just like me for who I am, type of thing. And I think, that is probably a big part of why I've become who I am, or why I try to be who I'm trying to be, which is seeing people for who they are, and letting, accepting people for who they are, how they feel like they need to be. I just wanted to be accepted that way. What kind of a shit-ass human being would I be if I didn't then accept other people for just trying to, be themselves?
Did you get to share with mom and dad? Did you talk to them about your sadness and isolation?
I did. They were very good, but I don't think they understood the gravity of it. So in 2019, I got to participate in a book. So I got to author this book called Diversity Matters. I wrote a chapter, and it was the first time that I had actually put everything down in one sort of piece of text. And so my mom and dad remembered little pieces of it, but seeing it all sort of written down in a book chapter, because part of the task was tell your story about DE&I, the diversity, equity, inclusion, and my story has to include all of those years as a kid where I was a diverse kid and had very little equity or inclusion. And so when the book was published and I gave my parents their copies, there was a lot of tears. I don't think it was, they did not realize.
What year was that? It was 19 or something like that?
2019 was when the book was published.
It's interesting because in some ways, ships passing in the night, right? The parents were there, they saw it, but it was student, kid. And you're government worker. And then, more or less in the same era, within 4 years, you guys both kind of wake up to the wholeness of the story.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, they knew aspects because oftentimes they'd be the ones who'd have to go into the principal's office and talk about stuff. But they certainly didn't know it all. And then to your point, I lived at home until I was 25, 26, and then I left. I went to Alberta, stayed there for 7 years, and I came back to Ontario, to Toronto, where I am now, in 2019, right around the time the book got published, actually. And the last 4 years of living through the pandemic with my folks has brought us a lot closer, for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of learning about who are we as humans? We don't often know our parents, especially in immigrant communities. I would say we don't often really know our parents as people. We just sort of know them as parents, and their roof, their rules, and those types of relationships. But to actually know who they are as humans is still a.
So you shift from this place of, really being picked on and isolated. And then when given the opportunity, you shift into all these different positions of leadership.
So this is where I'd say part of it was not very authentic, right? Part of it was I saw all these people, these 100 people, for example, these brown kids in my high school. And I was cool, there's more like me. Maybe if I had titles that made me. That's
exactly what I was thinking.
Now I'm more popular. Yes. Now I can have more. The influencers were not internally motivated. Again, this goes back to what we talked about at the outset, right? It's the influencers for why I became the grade 9 rep and things like that. I think the reason I can't remember anything about what I ran on is because it was probably all hocus pocus. It was probably all externally motivated bullshit. It was the desire to want more friends and feel what that feels.
Yeah, this title will create a dynamic in which people will have to like me or want to talk to
Correct.
me. I'll have something to offer. Yeah. I will. Yeah. And it's I love that you can own that, because we all have intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, and we benefit from owning and recognizing our shadow side as well as our light side. That's part of the leadership journey. There's ego in it for everyone.
And that's a loaded word too, but props when you can realize that your shadow side is equally as valuable as your sunny side, your light side, right?
Yes.
Like your shadow side is like deeply valuable. I mean, most of us, all of us, have deep-rooted insecurities. it is what it is. And you can either confront them or accept them or have a loving relationship with them, or you can pretend that they don't exist and sort of become a bit of an animal and a monster on all the other things so that you never have to show your insecurities. We're the deepest connection, and I think part of the reason why you and I got along within 34 seconds of talking to each other was our willingness to just sort of see ourselves and see each other as fallible human beings who are just trying their best to be meaningful contributors to those we love and beyond. And, even on the ego side, right? It's like, I'll share another quick sort of faith-based anecdote, which is ego is not in and of itself a bad thing, right? Like there's sort of
Correct.
The war on ego, which I think like there's a good intention behind like the war on ego, but like some level of self-esteem, self-worth, self-determination, right? Is like it's super important on a leadership journey. Like you need that. And I'm reminded of a story. So it was wartime. So you had the Sikh soldiers and you had the Mughal army, the Mughal emperors, and so we'll use the word Muslims, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable just calling them Muslims. We'll call them the Mughal.
Empire.
And so, largely speaking, if you were living under as a resident during Mughal rule, if you chose not to convert, you had to pay a higher tax, or you were killed, or your kids were taken from you. Like there was all sorts of tyranny associated with those rules. Anyway, so the fight's on, and one of the soldiers on the Sikh side was seen to be offering water and bandages to wounded soldiers on both sides, not just the Sikh side, but also on the Mughal emperor side, the Mughal army side. And so some of the Sikh soldiers got really annoyed and really upset with this, and they went back to our 10th Guru at the time and said, hey, your guy, one of our guys, he's a traitor. He's helping dress the wounds and take care of the wounded soldiers on the other side. And so he calls him in, the Guru calls him in and says, what are you doing? And he goes, what do you mean? What's wrong? And he goes, I've heard you've been dressing the wounds and feeding water to the wounded soldiers on the other side. Are you a traitor? What's the story? And he goes, I didn't even see it that way. Every face I looked into, all I saw was the eyes of you, like your eyes. All I saw was the face of my beloved. I was just serving my beloved at every point. And so it's a beautiful story about how service is like, it doesn't know any limits and no boundaries and yada, yada, yada. That's a great part of the story. The other part of the story is that if he was giving water to everybody, but his water jug was empty, he would be a sociopath. Imagine you're on your last breaths and somebody says, oh, I'm here to give you water. Let me fill your glass. And the jug is empty. And he goes, here you go. Here's that's sociopathic behavior. And so you have to have your jug full. There's a certain amount of selfishness and ego that you actually need to feed in order to be a servant. Because if you are empty, you're not very good to anybody. So even on the ego side, everything has to be a healthy relationship. What's your healthy relationship with your ego? Enough to fill yourself up, not so much so that you're a piece of shit. There is a healthy balance.
Another way to think about this is when I had my first experience of sort of unification, where I noetically felt that I was you, you were me, we are the plants, we are God. I mean, whatever your language is.
Yeah.
The question that emerged from that state for me was, well, what is then the point of separation? If everything is one, what is the point of separation? And that's the function, right? You don't have to have a religious belief. You don't have to have a spiritual belief. You don't have to have any belief in it at all to know that we are all the same stuff, that the photons coming from the sun 8 light minutes away enter my retina and affect my brain, that when I go for a run and get on a subway train because I was going to miss it and I sit down, the person next to me picks up the heat without touching me, that we are all exchanging the fundamental particles of the universe all the time. And so we are all truly the same thing. And in order to do those things, in order to have the eye to see, to have the legs to run or the butt to sit on the train, there must be separation between my physical self and your physical self or the world outside. And so that's like the framing for me, is the ego is the necessary separation that is required to keep us safe, moving, and active in the world. But the deeper truth is the unification in all of it. And so being aware of the reality that you have both, but choosing which gets to drive the car.
Again, drawing it back to modern day politics in the broader sense, right? It's like, what are most of our campaigners doing 99 times out of 100? They're focusing on the differences. They're focusing on the division, the divisiveness, right? They're calling out the why you are unsafe at the benefit of some other. There isn't inclusive communal language. It's very, individualized. You are at risk unless you vote for me types of language. And we know this from psychological science that negative news triggers. Yeah, it's super effective. What are you going to remember when you go to the polls? What kind of character are you going to vote for when you've got all those news imprints and now the social media impressions and all those types of things, right? Like, we are incentivized to forget our communalness, and that sucks.
It's effective, but it's not always true. It's not never true.
Oh, it's almost never true.
It's not, but it's not never true. And it's important to not overstate it, right? Because then that provides credence to the argument. But it's almost never true. In the same way that random acts of violence against people that look like other people very rarely hits the intended target. So I want to dig into your response to persecution as a kid. So yes, there's the ego side that decides to run, that says, I'm going to be important, I'm going to be special. Fair, it's there. But there's also the part of you that seemingly doesn't respond in the way that it could have, which is, now that I'm here, I'm going to use this position to subjugate or oppress or harm you, to pull your proverbial turban off your head, other person.
Yeah.
That's not what I see you do. I see you do something different. And I'm very curious if you have a sense of why in that moment you didn't take that path.
It's just not the value system. Like, look, I'm far from perfect. Like, it's not, I don't want to pretend like I just this noble thing that makes no mistakes. I'm sure I've definitely used various positions to somehow benefit, like, myself. But the idea of actively hurting somebody else because I now have the position of, pseudo power, like, I don't know, just never part of the psyche. From a family lens or a faith-based lens, the idea of, like, this notion of, like, restorative justice. I'm not going to pretend like I knew what that was when I was 14 years old, but to have a label like that now and sort of look back on it, it's like, there's no benefit I don't see the benefit on striking on somebody else just because you now have the role and you were subject. Like, this is the problem I sort of think about when we talk about boomers. It's like, well, no, you have to do it this way because that's how we did it. It's like, I don't know if that makes any sense. Like, it'd be kind of hypocritical for me to apply that to my leadership roles and my leadership positions when I don't even subscribe to that myself. Like, I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. I don't have a satisfying answer as to why I didn't. It's not who I am, I guess, or it's just not how I was raised, or it's just not, what influenced or inspired me.
And now a quick break from our sponsors, and we'll be right back to the show. The Healing Our Politics podcast is brought to you by the Elected Leaders Collective, the first, leading, and most highly recognized name in mental health, well-being, and performance coaching for elected leaders and public servants, designed specifically for you. Now, don't be fooled by the name. The Elected Leaders Collective is not just for elected leaders. It is for all public servants, staffers, volunteers, government, nonprofit, whole organizations. This is for you. If you are filled with passion for improving your community and world, but are tired, as I am, of the anger, stress, and vitriol, if you find yourself banging your head against that same wall, struggling with the incoming criticism and threats, arguing with colleagues who are supposed to be on your team, and questioning if it's even worth it anymore, then the Elected Leaders Collective programming is specifically for you. With the Elected Leaders Collective, you will learn to become a hashtag political healer, building the authentic, unshakable confidence and courage to stay true to yourself through the anger and pressure, while cultivating the open, empathetic mind to meet others with the curiosity, compassion, and kindness necessary to respond to threats, improve challenging relationships, de-escalate conflict, and bring people in your community together to solve real problems and get shit done. You'll reduce stress, anxiety, and overwhelm and become a more effective leader while having time for your family, yourself, your health, and your wealth, sleeping well at night, and showing others they can too. Now that's leadership. Healing Our Politics listeners receive 10% off all Elected Leaders Collective services using the code hashtag political healer. Use it today and become one of the brave political leaders healing our politics. Use code hashtag political healer by going to www.electedleaderscollective.com and starting today. That's www.electedleaderscollective.com and starting today. So let's pick up the timeline. So you're taking on some of these leadership roles. You mentioned maybe some athletics as well. Like, keep walking us through.
Yeah, played some sports in both elementary and high school. Played soccer and basketball. Probably had a career. I had an opportunity in soccer, but I hate running. So
sort of important for soccer.
Yeah, well, I was a
Not
goalie.
so important.
Slightly less important, but fitness is always important. But anyways, I remember after a high school game, we lost 2-1, but I could make the case it should have been 11-1. And I had a really good game, and on the opposing team, one of the players, just like uncles or whatever, had come up to me and was like, "Listen, if you can just work on your fitness, like you have a path. Like there's a path here for you." Later that year, I broke my foot. The following year, I hyperextended my elbow and was out for 12 weeks. And like I lost 2 years of training basically in the height of puberty when all of my peers were just like going up. And so anyways, by the time it was done, I was a step behind the other soccer players. So I played some sports, went into university, and just prior to my first week of university, I ended up in this like really brutal car accident with one of my best friends. And luckily, we're both walking away from it. And it could have been a lot worse than it was. It should have probably been a lot worse than it was. But that really set off like sort of a whole mental health piece where for about a year and a bit, I really pulled back from the student politics and the student engagement and the leadership and all that type of thing. I was just sort of healing and restoring for a couple of years.
Just physically? Like you just didn't have the energy or ability? Or
it was, I fell asleep at the wheel of a high speed collision. Oh, wow. There's a lot of like worthlessness feelings that came with that, right? Like how could I possibly, like what kind of idiot am I? Like those types of like, those types of real thoughts that sat with me for a while, especially, this friend of mine, she remains one of my best friends to this day. And she's like, I remember from the corner of my eye, her body just like flinging, she had fallen asleep as well. It was just a weekend. So she was asleep in the passenger seat. And, I remember flinging my head up just before the point of contact, and out of the corner of my eye, we make contact. Out of the corner of my eye, I see her body just like flaying into the airbag, and then like little memories and things that are imprinted forever. And it's like, wow, that's one of my bestest friends. Like, how could I do that to her? How could I do this at all? How could I put my parents through the stress of their kid going through an accident like that? And yada yada, all those like, how could you?
Yeah, and the story about yourself is all kinds of things.
So unpacking that took a couple of years, I think, right? And is indicative of a lot of the insecurities in my life, right? It's like, am I good enough? Am I valuable? Am I, what am I worth, right? And so that, for better or for worse, really shone a light on those questions because it physically hurt somebody I love. Again, I would say for better or for worse. There's a really great side to that question of like, am I being am I valuable? What is my worth? Which is good for self sort of reinforcement. But the flip side of that is like, what can I be doing better? How can I improve? So I feel like in a lot of ways, my journey for like continuous self-improvement started because of that accident.
Yeah. And it's generally, we find that the bigger the challenge, the greater the spotlight on the opportunity for the work. And it can be hard for people to hear that horrific events can actually be used for good. but it's true. It's 100% true. So what did that process look like for you? Like, how did you work through that over any number of years?
So most of my best friends are from this spiritual community, including this girl who I just talked about. So I didn't have, when I left high school, one of the reasons I chose the university I went to, I was born and raised in Ottawa. Ottawa has two good universities, the University of Ottawa and Carleton University. And many of my friends were going to the University of Ottawa. And I had, for some set of reasons, I sort of decided I actually needed to bridge off from that friend group. And so I actively chose the university, partially because I was like, I don't think I can become my best self if I stay attached to this friend group. But I was like, now I was entering a whole new place with none of my friends from school. So the whole journey of starting and making new friends, and there's actually an old buddy of mine from university who I owe so much to, because I used to walk into my calculus class. I used to have my headphones on. I'd just be listening to my music and didn't engage with anybody for the first couple of weeks of my first year following the accident, first year uni. And probably in month 2, this guy was sitting in front of me at calculus, and he turned around and he just knocked his hand on my table. He slapped the table in front of me, because I had my headphones in, so I was not paying attention to anything. He just slapped the table in front of me. And I was like, sorry, I have my headphones on, sorry. I was trying to ignore him. And he goes, take your headphones off, basically. I was like, fuck, okay, fine. So I take my headphones off. He goes, yo, what's your name? Anyways, he became one of my best friends through university.
Why were your headphones on all the time? What was the story in your head? Why were you trying to actively stay disengaged?
I was just in a low place. I just didn't want to engage with people. I didn't see the point. I don't know if this is the story I was telling myself back then, but certainly I can see that story being true, which is I don't want to get too close to anybody. What if I hurt them like I hurt, right? That whole thing, right? Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of unpacking in that phase. There's a lot of really shitty insecurities and irrational questions that came out. But again, it helped me confront irrational questions. It helped me tell better stories to myself, because in those days there were some pretty bad stories I was telling myself. And so this guy pounds his hand on my desk and forces me to basically be his friend. Turns out he lives 3 streets away from me. And so then we started commuting back and forth to school together. And all of a sudden I was like, oh shit, and he was a very outgoing, introduced me to a whole bunch of different things and people. And I sort of slowly started getting myself back.
Yeah. Sometimes you don't have to open every door. Sometimes the universe knocks. And I could imagine that at the time, should a dispassionate observer fly down and see, you young in your college career, having chosen to, this would be their judgment, not necessarily the truth, but abandon your friend group, go over here, disengage socially, be isolated. There's a tendency to pathologize that, to say that this is depression or this is wrong, this person needs help. And it's actually you were responding to what is, and that isolation provided you the space to do some really deep internal questioning and processing that now I'm guessing was really necessary, so that when you emerged out into the world, you actually emerged from that, metaphorical chrysalis in a much better place, more able to connect and serve. Is that true?
I think that's pretty bang on. Again, especially in hindsight, I'm not too sure if that's what I was thinking during the process, but in hindsight, bang on. What can I learn from this situation? How could I become a better person? At one point in my mid to late 20s, I went through a pretty devastating heartbreak. And I remember just asking myself, how is this? How could this? And I hit this point of nothing is sacred. So when I make that joke of I'm the most atheist religious guy, one of the things I was unpacking was my relationship with my faith. Mm-hmm. Nothing is so sacred that it can't be questioned, which is actually part of the baseline story of a Sikh. Mm-hmm. The idea of constantly being a seeker and explorer is actually exploring preconceived notions of what we think truth is and asking questions.
Question everything.
So, question everything and find answers. And if you don't have the answers yet, the answers will come. But nonetheless, going back to this dialogue, one of the other things I like to sort of think about myself is my only principle is that I have no principles. Meaning, when I was finishing high school, and this is actually really important to the story, I think, one of my friends, a good close friend of mine, she died in a car accident a year before my car accident, actually. And she was from Vancouver, Surrey, and she was on her way to Calgary with a group of young Sikh people who were going to be participating in a volunteer capacity for a really important religious event. Long story short, took a wrong turn, went down the wrong highway. They were racing to come back, and middle of the night, and the van flips over. 3 people die. She's one of them, 17 years old, one of my close friends. And that's like the first time I experienced like really major loss of a loved one. I was 17, grade 12. And that also helped me become a bit more recluse, right? Because it's like, wow, the whole fragility of life thing. Like, she's 17. If she can go yesterday, I could go tomorrow, right? So probably one of the first points where like we're so full of ourselves on our on our perceived immortality and our perceived invincibility. This shit is so fragile. Like, this shit is so fragile. I think that's probably the first data point where I was like, that was a big part. And so then I had my accident a year later. Anyways, I bring this back because one of the I remember I was driving with my eldest sister one day shortly after my friend had died. So between the 2 accidents, I forget what she asked me, but I remember sharing with her, like, one of the key things that I really took away from as a learning lesson from that whole experience was the idea that everybody has something to offer. Like, there is nobody at all, nobody I can't learn something from. Yeah. Like, there's nobody who doesn't have something, whether that's a billionaire running a conglomerate or a homeless guy like picking up bottles. Everybody has something to teach me, and if I'm willing, I can learn from all of them. And so when you talk about like the going through the struggles and like the way that the story can be told, that like, yeah, hard things can teach you things. Like, there is and accepting what is, I think, is how you said it. There's a term in Sikhi called hukam. Hukam is effectively the present reality. So it just is what it is. Like, there's a certain level of like, this is where it is. So operate from this place. Don't operate from fanciful and wishful thinking. Don't operate from a fictional place. Like, the reality is what it is. And you may define that reality slightly different from the way I define that reality, but that's okay. We're 2 different people. Our realities are probably different. Our ideas of truth are probably different. It's fine. But when you start living in a dream world, your level of satisfaction, contentment, happiness, whatever word you want to use with the world around you and how you're operating within that world will dwindle, and you'll just constantly be angry with the way things are because you're operating from a dreamland. So if you can escape the dreamland and just say, look, this is what it is, and call things sort of as they are and operate from that place, then you can really push through. And I think this is when we talk about these communities you identified, whether they be Jewish Americans, Iranian Americans. Certainly I can speak for the Sikh community in this regard. Like, there's a certain element of just saying, you know what, fuck it, this is where we're at.
That's right.
We are here. So if we're going to do things, we have to operate from reality. Right. And accepting that reality is vital.
We say all the time in our coaching work, every time you fight reality, you lose.
100%.
Right? And it's a radical question, but it's like, no matter what it is, whether it is a policy not going your way, whether it's frustration over your workload at home, whether it's, the experience of being triggered by someone else's actions, whether it's cancer. The question is like, if this was divinely orchestrated for me, if this was truly working for me, what is this moment here to teach me?
100%.
And it's a hard question for a lot of people to ask, but it is the most freeing question, because even when you are in the pit of despair, even when you haven't taken off your headphones, metaphorical or otherwise, for 2 years, that's the question that is ultimately going to get them off and have you step into the world more whole. Yeah. I'm curious, just when you're in these periods of processing, whether it's after your friend dies or after your car accident, I'm sure there are a number of other periods like this in your life. What are you doing? Like, what's the actual practice look like?
It's probably not the same each time. So let's think. I mean, there's a big focus on meditation in the Sikh path. For whatever, again, like I don't know the why or the answer. I think it comes from whether it's parents or community or whatever. But I guess I've always felt very comfortable resorting back to guidance from faith as a starting point for how to navigate the hard things in life. So the process never looked the same, right? Like, you start from that meditative place. I've alluded to this idea of your little voice, right?
Yes.
Like, you try to, like, what's the little voice saying? Like, truly, right? Like, there's like the narrative that you have in your mind, but even if you quiet that down, there's still a little voice, right? Like, what's that little voice? What's that little voice looking for? What's that little voice saying?
What does that mean to you? Is that like what people would describe as intuition, or how do you think about the little voice?
Yeah, you call it intuition, or like, without sounding too cheesy or new agey, it's like, it is your soul's voice. Like, it's like, there's your mind's narrative, which I think is still very conscious, and then there's a subconscious. There's a subconscious voice that, when we say things like, deep inside, as a coach, I'm sure you appreciate this more than most, which is, deep inside you, all the answers are there.
Yes.
Like, it's not like the coaches have answers to questions.
That's right.
Coaches, generally speaking, are asking questions to help you find your
That's
own
right.
answers, because they, right? And so it's sort of a self-guided, self-led process, right? Through meditation to help find those answers for yourself. And so sometimes that subconscious wants you to do X, Y, or Z, and it starts there. Then afterwards it materializes in different ways. But one of the things that has always been really true for me is like coming to that place of meditation, sitting with my instruments, right? Singing and playing instruments, playing music, as far as being a tool to sort of help tap into the process. Physically, depending on, after my car accident, I wasn't physically allowed to do much at all for fear of injuries and the stability but like after a heartbreak, I was in the gym every day. Like different things call for different responses. So again, probably an unsatisfying answer, but it always started sort of with like, okay, what does the little voice really need right now? Various times I've chosen to have a therapist, and various times I've chosen to really deepen my relationship with sort of like doctrinal faith, if you will, because that felt like the thing I needed to do to restore some balance. Or different times it was, I hit the gym really hard, or but I think that's very human for me anyways. Like, we're dynamic, right? One of the things that I was taught early on is every human being is a dynamic being, right? Like, just because you do one thing one way doesn't mean you have to do the other thing the exact same way. And this is both scary and daunting as much as it is amazing and fantastical, which is that, like, it's not the same recipe every time. It probably doesn't need to be. I'm going to be a different person at the end of this podcast than I was when I started. And so the way I react to things around me could look different.
So just to put a little bit of a finer point on it for someone listening at home who's having their headphone moment, knowing that it's always a learning and the approach will change over time. But if you were to isolate the 2 or 3 practices, just as bullet points, like meditation's a bullet point, that have been most personally beneficial to you over the course of your life and pulling you through challenging moments, what do you think they'd be?
Surround yourself with inspired people, not just inspiring, but inspired people. Have a community, seek out a community of inspired people. They should be self-inspired. I think you want to seek out people who are inspired themselves, because they will live in a way that you can emulate, at least to start, right? And sort of discover, how can I self-inspire so that when I am in these places, I can also pull myself out. So it becomes sort of subsistence farming, if you will. Like at the very worst of times, when I feel like I have nothing else, at least I have myself. Like, how can I learn to find that sort of baseline inspiration just from myself? I think journaling is super powerful. I don't do enough of it. This is my hypocritical statement of the podcast. I don't do enough journaling at all. But I think journaling helps you define or identify the questions you need answers to. And sometimes they can actually be a pathway to the answers, but I think the questions are almost always more important anyways. Like, the more questions you have, the more you're exploring. Answers are great, but the questions are really important. And I think journaling helps you uncover, like, what are actually the core questions that I'm actually thinking about when I've got my headphones on, going through a tough time. What are the real questions that are important? You hear this all the time. This is the trope, right? Is, you have to ask better questions to get better answers. But there's a truth to that. Like, you really want to find good questions and integral questions. There's a whole movement out there called integral thinking. It's sort of fringe, right? It's sort of like law of attraction-y type of idea. And what I really took away from it is this idea. Like, I do have some reasonable amount of belief that once your thoughts are really good, right, you can then inspire better actions, and actions become habits, and habits become character, and all that whole loop. But the thoughts have to be good thoughts, right? Like, they have to be like not half-assed thoughts. Like, you can't just be like, oh, I want a mansion. If the law of attraction thing is real at all, that ain't it, right? Like, it's the idea that like if you ask the right questions and you actually meditate on those questions, you will find your pathway out of the headphone state. But the first thing is you actually have to want to get out of the headphone state.
Sure.
In my case, I did. But here's the thing, right? And even that is like, this is where sometimes it is the universe that really just has to intervene. Like my buddy who slaps his hand on the table in front of me forces me to take my headphones off. That's the only reason the headphones came off.
But that's part of why you're finding inspired people as well, right? Is like you are orchestrating an environment in which someone directly or indirectly is more likely to slap your headphones off.
100%. Absolutely true. Yeah. So like, I think there's a trifecta there that's really helpful. Find community of inspired people. Journal to keep track of your own thinking and how your thinking might be changing over time. And meditate. Sit. Whether that meditation is through yoga and breathing, fine. Whether it's through mantra and chanting, fine. Whether it's through just like stillness of thoughts and measuring your thoughts, fine. Whether it's trying to think of nothing and do this sort of the Buddhist approach of nothingness, fine. Who cares? Like, just find the thing that resonates with you. Sometimes one thing will resonate with you on a Monday that's different than a Thursday. Keep a pulse on yourself and do the things that help and support you.
So recognizing and honoring that everyone's different and that there's a different tool for everyone, but to get specific on what works for you so that if people wanted to try it, they could. What does your meditation practice look like?
It's actually just that dynamic. One of the reasons I slipped out those 4 different approaches is because some days I feel like what's hitting is the chanting, and other days that are hitting is just like monitoring my thoughts. So it's pretty fluid when it comes to sitting down on the cushion, right? I've got a little defined meditation area in my condo, and it's I think that's sort of nice and important. It's like to sort of set a space that has an intention, even if it's just a corner of an otherwise open room, which is what mine is. It's a little corner next to the window so I can look outside and have natural light.
It's a dedicated space, or does it ever flex to something else?
No, it's a dedicated space. So, like for example, I made a meditation cushion for myself, and it's a really, really comfortable little pillow. Sometimes the pillow leaves the meditation nook and becomes my couch pillow, but it is still my meditation pillow. So it goes back to the meditation nook. And so the nook is the nook. And I put a couple of pieces of art that I feel like are supportive of that little area. It's a really funky looking area in my living room, because my TV is also there and my couch is also there. But like the nook is the nook. It's like this little corner. It's not at all subdivided. Like there's no wall that separates it from any other part of the space. It's just that is the corner. So that's also the corner where my harmonium, my instrument is, which is what I use to help me sing. But in terms of the tactical, like how am I meditating on any given day, it really is sort of like, what do I feel like I need most in that moment? Is it a chant? Then I'll chant. If it's just a quiet repetition of a mantra, that's fine too. If it's there is no 5-word answer to your question. It really depends on the day. If
you wanted to share with the audience one of those, just maybe because they're not going to hear it from someone else, or maybe because it's just special to you, or is there one that you would choose to share in specific? I mean, look, I grew up in a Sikh community. The word that we repeat when we meditate or contemplate is chant. It's Vaheguru. That's the word. That's sort of what we sort of assign as sort of the name of God. So you're reciting the name of God. So that's always been particularly special and important in my meditation. And you sit on a cushion. Is there a particular duration, eyes closed or open, body position? What does that look like? Mostly eyes closed, usually cross-legged, but not by any rule. Sometimes I'm stretched out, sometimes I'm lying down. But most of the time it's sort of eyes closed, cross-legged. Sometimes with like a musical accompaniment, sometimes without it. I might play like a track, like a meditation track in the background that sort of has like a neutral tone, like those binaural beats types of things, right? If you see them on not or just Guns like N' Roses or Eminem.
Yeah, correct. Okay. Yeah. And then either I'll chant out loud if I want to, or it'll be quiet. That's like the starting point. I'll try every day to start with that, and if it's just not hitting, then I'll move down the chain to other tactics or techniques. Would you be willing to like give us like a 5-second of what that chanting sounds like, so we get like the cadence and that? Yeah, sure. So with eyes closed, it'd be Vaheguru, 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 Vaheguru. I mean, the tunes don't matter. but whatever sort of resonates at a pitch or whatever, there's physiological things, right? Sometimes when you sing a little lower, you feel it vibrate in your body a bit more. You sing a little higher, you elevate your consciously or your mood a little, or whatever it is, right? The point being is find something that works for you, sit there and chant repeatedly. And again, sometimes that doesn't do it, right? Sometimes for me, it doesn't quite hit, and then I just move down the chain and try focus on your breath, focus on your thoughts, focus on this, focus on whatever. Just find something and make that your meditation journey for the day. But I always start with the chanting. That's sort of always step one.
And then the practice is just, even as you're chanting, the mind will wander and you use that to anchor and come back to the chanting.
I think that's the other thing about meditation that sometimes gets lost is the mind wandering is kind of the
kind of the point. That's the wind sprint of the practice.
Yeah. Like, that's exactly it. It's like, I think there's some methods out there that sort of say, oh, your mind shouldn't wander. I think the point is that your mind is going to wander.
Yeah, that's the practice, is bringing the mind back. Because when you're in the world and you get distracted or reactive or angry, it's not to ameliorate anger from your emotional repertoire. It's to recognize when that's driving your behavior and be able to bring it back to a center.
And also that when people go into meditation spaces and they take their journal and they share their thoughts, or they write down their thoughts, like, there's also aha moments that come from the wandering thoughts during meditation.
Yes.
Like, so the wandering thoughts could actually be the thing you're looking for. Not just as a thing that you have to control and bring back to center, but actually the wandering thoughts in a context that is in a sort of like trying to waken up your subconscious, right?
Yes.
Like, or tap into that. Like, the wandering thoughts might actually be the gift.
Yeah.
You don't have to create an enemy out of your wandering thoughts, is the point, right? Like,
right.
The wandering thoughts might actually be the gift.
I mean, literally this morning when I was meditating, I had a wandering thought came in, which had to do with, my team in this podcast production. But I have to do the mental gymnastics of like, oh, I noticed that. That's interesting. Bring it back. Then the wandering thought comes in of like, oh, shit, what if I don't remember? Then I'm not going to do the thing I need to do. And then I have to remind myself, oh, but that's what this practice is about. It's about letting go and trusting. Okay, I've seen it, I observe it, and now I'm back to, for me, I count. I use like a Zen, whatever. It's the same as the mantra, right? So it serves the same function. At the end, I remembered it, and then in my journal, I circle it, and I go back to it later. But sometimes I don't, and that's the practice,
Yeah, it is. That's the point. That is the point. And that's because it's also like so emblematic of life, right? Like, you will stumble, or
yes.
What might look like a stumble even to yourself, let alone to other people, actually isn't a stumble. It's actually like it goes back to everything that you said earlier around have moments of adversity and perceived, depression or perceived weakness or whatever actually can be catalysts for something greater. Right? They're just microcosms of sort of how you work and walk in your life.
The journaling, finding good questions, and maybe this is the integral thinking piece, maybe it's something different, but I may have a challenge and say, oh, I've heard about this journaling thing and I need to ask better questions. Well, what's a good question? So how do you navigate that page?
Stream of consciousness, honestly, and like, this is one of those things where, especially if you're somebody who looks in the mirror and you say things like, I'm data driven, this should resonate. Which is, you actually just have to start. Like, you actually have to create the habit and let the data accumulate. The streams of consciousness day after day, and even if it's just for like a minute or two. Again, I'm hypocritically speaking about this because I don't do this well.
Sure. There's two types of people. There's like hypocrites and liars.
In this case, hypocrite hat is on for sure. Like, when I have been doing it well, even if it's just for a couple of minutes a day, you write down some, whether it's gratitude thoughts or whatever, or it is the stream of consciousness of like just where your mind is going on something you've been thinking about all day. And then you allow 5 and 10 and 15 days worth to sort of build up, and you look back on it and you start seeing certain patterns, and they start bringing out like those patterns are ultimately like sort of compasses to the questions that maybe are actually on your mind that you didn't know were on your mind because you didn't think about them in that way.
What does that review process look like for you? So do you literally go back and review? Is that just also sort of like when I feel like it, or is there a particular pattern or commitment of that review? Like how does that happen?
Yeah, when I'm doing it well, it can be as frequently as a week, but otherwise like even every month, right? Like just if you've got the habit down, how fast you review becomes less of a concern because you know that you're disciplined at generating the data. So
like once a day, or
journaling once a day, sure, but reviewing like once a month, once a week, whatever feels, whenever you want to. I mean, some of the leaders I've worked for would insist on weekly. Like they would like write every night before bed. Sometimes it was a to-do list for the next day. Sometimes it was a contemplation or a unique thought or whatever. It's just, it doesn't, again.
Yeah, put something on the paper.
Put something on paper. Like, just put something on paper and then look back and sort of, you can then ask yourself, like, I wonder why I prioritize these things. Or like, I wonder, I wonder how this thought that I had on Monday actually showed up on Thursday without me even knowing, without consciously knowing.
Do you pick a particular time of day to capture?
When I'm doing it well, it's before bed.
Before bed.
These days I'm not doing it well, so it doesn't happen almost ever. But I'll write before bed. There was a period of time actually right at the beginning of the pandemic where I was actually really good at waking up at like 4:30 in the morning, 5 o'clock, starting off with some like workouts and Wim Hof breathing and just cold showers and all that, and then settling into a meditation and a journal. Really beautiful way to start the first 2 hours of the day, but just for me wasn't sustainable. I'm not the world's best morning.
The cold showers are tough. I did half of one this morning, and it's tough.
Congrats. Yeah, no, I love me a good cold plunge. I hate cold showers, but cold plunges I'm here for. But yeah, no, it was really good. I would journal first thing in the morning, but I think more sustainably for me, it's right before bed.
Yeah. So this is maybe a good segue to something that I've noticed in your work, and maybe you wouldn't even notice it this way, and I talked about this in the intro, you to me exemplify a pretty rare presentation of left and right brain balance. And the way I see that is when I piece apart some of your accomplishments and awards, I tend to see a lot of the sort of method of implementation as being very evidence-based, systemically rooted, logical, but the aim or the intent of that process is very frequently a very human, heart-centered, socially oriented endeavor. And I wonder if you agree with that characterization as a starting point, and then could talk a little bit about that orientation and being able to access both sides of that equation.
It's so beautifully put. I don't think I've ever thought about it or talked about it that way. So I appreciate you verbalizing it that way, because I might need to update my bio now. But it's interesting, like, okay, what's the big problem I'm working on right now? I'm totally absolutely like policy driven. When I think about policy, I think about big problems. So like one of the big policy problems in Canada right now is around workforce. And now I'm sharing a little bit about what I'm working on and how this is showing up. And it's interesting because as you were saying it, I was thinking, gosh, there's so many people who are underemployed, or there's so many people who, we talked about Indigenous people earlier, they're systemically underemployed. For a variety of reasons. There's newcomers and immigrants who are, if not underemployed, they're certainly underpaid or underutilized for what their skills and competencies are. They're doctors in Iran or engineers in India, but they come to Canada, and for some reason we can't make them doctors or engineers because whatever. I can give you all the stats, right? I'll do the research. I have the research on how ineffective or inefficient or what this spells for Canada's economy in a GDP perspective and all the data evidence piece. And you're right. The thing I really care about is how come a person can't just actually freely become the best version of themselves.
Yeah, how can we match a person's experience to their potential?
Yeah. Because if they do that, they're going to earn more. They're going to pay more taxes. My roads are going to be better.
They're going to be happier and less upset with you in traffic. And
they're going to be happier. Our collective happiness will go up.
Yes.
So yeah, there's a real blend of left and right brainedness there that I don't think I've actually necessarily called out. Like I really do care about humans, especially like when I can hear and see and feel the individuals' stories. I also like operating at the system level. So that's an example, I guess. It's I saw it actually now that we're talking about it. Like even on Trans-Canada Trail Days, like when I was on the board when the pandemic hit, And Canada's pandemic lockdowns were pretty substantial, like pretty significant. Like you couldn't go to gyms, you couldn't go to a lot of places to congregate at all, shopping malls, grocery stores, whatever it was, right? Like a lot of places where people might go just to have social contact were off limits. Not the trail though. The trail was outdoors. And we saw what the trail did for mental health. We saw what it did for education. We saw what it did to bring communities that otherwise might not connect with each other together. And there's science and data on all the reasons why nature is great. But the powerful piece for me was actually seeing it happen in action, the human side of that. So I really appreciate the way you characterize it. I've never put those two things together in that way. I've often just said I'm policy driven because policy affects everybody.
What's interesting, you also said, and I heard this, and I think it was an interview that you did, but you kind of took this journey over the course of your life from policy being in the way to policy being the way. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it's true. I used to, when I first started on my entrepreneurial journey, I talked about policymakers being in the way of innovation, just abjectly because there's this like idea that policymakers move too slowly or they don't know how to respond to innovation, all that, which might be true. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, the policymaker's job is not to be an innovator, it's to establish the right conditions for and the right environment for innovation. And I think that's just something that age and a little bit of wisdom has taught me, which is that policy can absolutely be the way for people to think about things in different ways, right? Like where it can go sideways is when policy establishes artificial constraints that are constraints for constraint's sake. But when you create regulation and policy and compliance requirements, naturally, most of the time, the business sector pushes back on those because it just makes it a little bit harder to do business. But a lot of entrepreneurial people or innovators will look at those new constraints and say, awesome, what's the next thing that we can figure out with this new set of constraints? Like it's almost like a game. And so, not that I'm an advocate for bad policy, but policy and policy making and policy changing are all avenues for new innovation. Mm. You can spend your time and energy being angry at policy, or you can spend your time and energy sort of looking at it and saying, okay, well, what is this new game? The pieces on the board have changed. So now what are the moves? And I think that's where my relationship with policy has gone, because generally speaking in our countries, certainly not absolutely, but generally the policies are in place to attempt to protect people, to protect consumer interests. They don't always hit the mark. They're not always great. They don't always land that way. But when you start from a place that you actually don't have to be angry at every new policy or regulation or compliance, you can actually you can behave a lot more innovatively.
Yes.
So that's helped for me.
Yeah. Did you find that through experience of working with policymakers, or how did you make that transition?
So after I sold my first company, I ended up at TELUS, which is a telecommunications firm, about $16 billion a year in revenue, and I was their director of government relations for Western Canada.
It's a big job.
It's a big job, especially because actually I was never political. As we talked about a bit earlier, I always sort of saw myself as apathetic. And here was this massive firm saying, cool, you should definitely be our government relations person. And that was probably the first time, A, I don't know why I said yes to the job, and B, I don't know why they gave it to me. I don't know why I said yes. But looking back, it makes total sense, going back to it, right? Posterity makes that story make total sense, because when I got into that role, it was absolutely an idea of, okay, how can you leverage a massive institution for influence to get the outcomes that we as a private sector organization need in order to maximize the profitability and our market share, and yada, 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 yada. On the flip side, my primary stakeholder, even more so than my own CEO, was governments of different provinces, and trying to figure out what are your goals? What are the policy objectives that you have on your whiteboards collectively and individually that we, as a massive owner of connectivity infrastructure and investor, that we can actually help you achieve. And when you start looking at what are some of the policy objectives of these organizations, it's those are great objectives. We should have more kids who are escaping foster care. There should be a pathway for them to have mobile connectivity, because as soon as they hit 18, they're suddenly without any resources. We should at least provide them an access point. So it's we can do that. We can do that as a major telco. We can figure out a pathway that both is profitable for us, subsidized for the 18-year-old kid, and a, generally speaking, positive policy outcome. Like, we can do these things. And when you start looking at policy from a point of like, we're trying to achieve this thing for this purpose, can you help as a private sector actor? Then policy environments ultimately end up setting not just the rules of the game, but they actually shine a light on the opportunities for you to contribute to a national dialogue, which is where I keep on, or a provincial dialogue, which for me comes back to nation building is really, the core for what I want to do.
So I'm wondering if you encountered in that role distrust from government officials or staffers when you were bringing that forward. And that's coming from a place of, when I was last in elected office, our number one goal was around housing. And there were a number of private sector developers who genuinely, lived and cared for the community, that wanted to see housing delivered, and who had businesses that were very successful delivering housing much faster and more efficiently than government was, who would come and say, hey, we'd love to work with you on this. And it was perfectly in line with our goals and something that at least I viewed as a great benefit and opportunity. Great. Why don't we outsource the things that we know we're not good at and make sure that the outcomes are still driving towards the impact that we seek? But that was not universally the case. There was a lot of history that I, may disagree with, but understand. And there was a lot of distrust. And there was a lot of, well, those are just greedy private sector people. We can't trust them. Shut them out. Let's keep the control. Well, the price of the control is you don't actually get the thing that the citizens need. And it's actually very harmful. Did you come across similar perspectives, and how did you work, like you said, accepting reality? How did you work with that?
The old adage, right? Trust is difficult to create and very easy to break.
Yeah.
Trust is also, I think, a byproduct of your track record of integrity. So, in my case, I worked for an organization that was also year after year after year was one of the most philanthropic organizations in the country. Massive community investment teams in pretty much every market, over 20,000 people that we operated in. Like there was a constant dialogue of how do we show up in these communities? How do we show up in a way that TELUS should as a telco that makes sense, right? And also espouses the values that we think of and care about, which I say TELUS did an amazing job at. So to your question around trust, like I inherited a trusting sort of position because it's been on Darren's the CEO of TELUS to this day. And Darren has always been very clear that if we're not engaged in the communities in which we are offering our services, then we're bad actors. And I say we, and I'm not there anymore, but we're bad actors if we're not actually engaged and proving that we're engaged and telling the stories of how we're engaged, doing the marketing of all that, and being able to tell the stories. Because then when I go into the government office, I can say, yeah, we employ this many people and we pay this much in tax and yada, yada, yada. But also, by the way, you're a representative of, Nanton, Alberta, small town Nanton, where, TELUS invested this much in fiber optic that resulted in this many new businesses starting that also ended up in this festival we sponsored for $50,000, whatever, right? Like we showed up. And so the trust there was probably easier than, say, a oil and gas extraction company in British Columbia, where the political climate is different. And energy extraction and fossil fuel extraction is just like generally looked down upon in British Columbia versus, say, Alberta. Society, like at an aggregate level, if you were to pull the numbers. I used to sort of half-jokingly say it was really easy for me to go to sleep every night because the problems that we were talking to the provinces about were how do we get more connectivity in the hands of people so they can be better educated or they can have better career outcomes or job outcomes. And it was the trust piece that wasn't inherently a challenge. On the flip side, because I do a little bit of work around housing now as well. And yeah, it's like the developers who actually fulfilled their commitments of, say, producing a park or a public park or, green space that benefited people or whatever. Like the things, it comes down to like, are you doing what you say you'll do? Or do you always come in with a fancy dress and beautiful jewelry and just like, tell me a good story? right? Like if all you're good for is telling me a good story, then I'm going to trust you less and less. And I think the Edelman Trust Barometer from last year really speaks to this, which is government is not a trusted entity anymore. The institutional, big international institutions are not trusted entities anymore because there's just a lot of lip service, and there's a lot of people who don't feel in their experience that they're seeing the lip service actually come to light. And so ironically, for the first time, I think, since Edelman started the Trust Barometer, private business was the most trusted segment of civil society, above and beyond your own governments and our international institutions. And that in itself is like a really interesting development, that people trust business today arguably more than they trust their own elected officials who they actually get to choose if you go and vote, right? But like, you don't even trust those people as much as you trust the grocery chain that might be, overcharging you for salami. Like, it's a really interesting shift in trust.
I wonder if, and recognizing this is just hypothesis, it's hypothetical, but you talked about considering and deciding against, for now, running for office. If you had run, you would have faced the reality of entering a position that by default is distrusted, even though it wasn't of your own making. And I'm wondering if you gave thought to how you would have addressed the challenge of rebuilding trust in that position if you had gone in.
So when I was seriously contemplating how I would do this, if I would do this, and also what level, would I do municipal as you did, or would I do it at the state level as technically you also did, or would I do it at the federal level? And so in each case, you have to start with the fact that you represent a constituency. So in Canada, we're first past the post, we're parliamentary. We are elected based on our geographical ridings. Our first and foremost priority as elected officials is to those people. So you have to build trust in those communities. So even for me, when I was contemplating whether or not I would go into the world of electoral politics, it was a 10-year decision. Meaning, if I decided in 2023 that the answer was yes, it doesn't mean that I was going to run in 2024 or 2025. It was, okay, for the next 10 years, I'm going to do the things that would make me an authentic, genuine contributor to the political dialogue, because I will go live in the community that I want to represent. I'll go make the relationships, authentic relationships and allies with those community organizations and those people, and build the trust there and become a voice and become a representative voice outside of political halls. That would have been the path. And I think that's how the trust has to build. Then you win the seat, you win the trust of the party, you win the trust of your peers, both on your party and other parties. And then you just, the bigger the portfolio, the bigger the task of trust building. It's work. Like, at the end of the day, trust building is not fucking words, it's work. You got to actually do the work. And you're going to make mistakes, and the mistakes some people will perceive as a reason why you're no longer trustworthy because you made a mistake. And that's, I think, part of the whole poison and toxicity of politics right now, which is human beings making mistakes become political points, right? And so this is a nonpartisan issue. You see it federally, you see it provincially, you see it when it's a liberal leader, an NDP leader, or a conservative leader. The opposition is always making, and I've been listening to Mehdi Hassan's How to Win an Argument. Mehdi Hassan is the guy from MSNBC, and he talks about the ad hominem argument and sort of a tell of the world we live in at the political dialogue level, which is, these are still people. Like, there's still people who are trying to come up with ideas for better, for a better Canada or a better US or a better Nevada, whatever. And they will make mistakes. I feel like there is this notion of the good old days where perhaps once upon a time in the good old days, we debated ideas and we didn't, talk about people. But I think there's always been this case where if you're opposition, regardless of what your partner, regardless of your partisan stripe, if you are opposition, part of your job is to destroy the credibility of those who hold the power. And in Mehdi Hassan's book, he talks about how, arguably from a moral, or whatever you want to call moral, maybe we should be against the ad hominem argument that by virtue of Skippy making a mistake with an initiative that he really led on Aspen Council, therefore, because the mistake was made, that means Skippy's a bad governor. It's that's not actually necessarily true, but the argument resonates. If you play the ad hominem well, you reduce the trust that people have in your opponent, because all you're doing is constantly kicking at their credibility instead of their results, instead of their actual actions, instead of their strategies. And so you're not debating ideas, you're debating people, which we've always all been taught as kids. And like growing up is like, that's not how you do it. Like people can have questionable backgrounds, but great ideas. Let's talk about ideas.
When you talk about the balance of ego versus whatever essence or unification, this is, I think, where it really comes back into play, is that attempt to destroy your opposition is an ego move, because it helps you in the short term, but it catastrophically damages the system in the long term and ultimately harms everybody of every party.
And then everybody who wants to participate in the system is then subject to said system, which means they don't continuously join. Under it. Yeah. And then you have that problem where like they say that, the good people never join. And then it almost self-selects what kind of people are willing to even put their foot in that sort of shit show to begin with. And then there's that whole negative diatribe on, if you're in politics, it's because you're in it for all the wrong reasons. Well, that's not true either.
That's not true either.
But there is this big behemoth of a system that, like, one of the reasons I took last year to question whether or not the electoral path was my path was I was getting tired of being angry about the way things were going. And I thought, okay, well, if I'm angry, my options are just stop being angry or do something about it. Mm-hmm. Like staying here in a mode of angry doesn't serve me, that's for sure. It certainly doesn't serve my loved ones. It probably doesn't serve my work. So I need to do something about it. Stop being angry, which is, its own detachment process of like actually be, outcome independent to like which party is going to do what. I'm only going to be alive for another 70 years. How bad could it possibly get? Whatever. Or, shut up and get in. Mm-hmm. And be angry if it's angry that you need to be, but more importantly, be active. Like actually play a role in being part of the change. But I think part of the reason why I ended up saying no, at least now is not the time, comes to this point that like the vitriol, the ad hominem of it all, I know I make mistakes. I know I've made lots of mistakes. There is no reason for anybody in my family to be subject to the mistakes that I make. But in a political cycle, it's no holds barred these days. It feels as though if you can attack the credibility of a person at their most personal level, then you're gonna score the points.
How central was that consideration to your ultimate decision not to do it at this time?
Probably a top 3 reason.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the top reason. Like as a kid who was bullied, I'm not a stranger to people saying shitty things about me. It is what it is. Like that part's okay. The part of it that's problematic is like, if I'm out in public and I'm with a family member or my partner or whatever, the random aggressive hollering or yelling at a public event or by some random person who's just angry, subjugating loved ones to that feels like a choice I don't want to make. So that's sort of a top 3.
And that is something that I think is truly new. When your dad was in his position, nobody did that at your dinner table. And although politics, we can have rose-colored glasses and think, oh, it was great back then. It wasn't. The 1800s were, in this country, we had a civil war. I mean, it was really nasty. But nobody knew what those bureaucrats looked like. There was no internet. No one knew who they were looking for at dinner. So unless you were in your very immediate circle, that's what didn't happen. The version of your dad now probably does have to deal with that, even though they're not the person on the camera.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, and for the ones who are on the camera, like last week I went to an event here in town with the Minister of Housing, and it was a great event. He was actually pretty candid about the things that his government has done wrong, which is fantastic, because you like to hear it.
Yes.
And I came down and was about to go jump in my Uber, and there was a group of 15 protesters from sort of a grassroots organization or whatever who were against all the COVID mandates and things like that. And they had their megaphones and they had their signs, and it's like, why are you using your valuable time in your day to do this? I mean, protest is such an important part of democracy, so I'm not knocking the notion of protest, but it's like, yeah, like this guy's not talking about anything that has to do with why you're here.
And you're inadvertently creating a situation where he's more likely to be closed off, dishonest, not own the negatives, which is actually the connective tissue that you're talking about that made you feel like, oh, I can trust and listen to this person.
Yeah. I remember I had the opportunity to, a few years ago when I still lived in Alberta, I had the opportunity to meet a future leader of one of the parties up here. And I had asked him just a really simple question when he was doing his leadership nomination work across the country. My question to him is, can you tell me one good thing that the incumbent government has done? Yes, you would end up serving as his opposition, but can you tell me one good thing that he's done? It just has to be one. And he goes, no, I can't think of any one thing. I'm like, you can't think of a single good thing. Like, you're entering this whole thing from the position that every breath that person takes is like wrong for the country. How are we supposed to build?
There's no way through.
My empathy for policymakers really grew during the pandemic because, like, lots of mistakes were made. So many mistakes were made, whether it was around the messaging around vaccines or the way we thought that this was going to be a 2-week experience or whatever it is. Like, so much was handled poorly. And also, we were all collectively learning so much so quickly about this stupid little thing, right? Like, and history will decide what was right and what was wrong. But in the moments, like, you know, and you would know this better than most people having served in office, but you can't change the rules every week or 10 days or every 2 weeks when you learn something new about a mutation or whatever. You can't just keep on changing the rules. If you think what happened eroded trust, could you imagine how little trust there would be if policies were changing every 2 weeks based on new information about the, like, I gained a lot of empathy for policymakers during the pandemic because it's like, how are you supposed to direct an entire nation or an entire state when things are changing so quickly? You need to maintain some sense of stability. You need to maintain some sense of trust and consistency. And yet the thing that you're trying to do that around has no stability or consistency. That thing is changing all the time.
Yeah.
And as a policymaker, you're fucked because you're always going to be wrong. And it's wild because in those contexts, you're just never going to be right. It was so easy when I was a younger entrepreneur to shit on it and just be like, oh, they're just in the way. And I think COVID and that whole journey, at the end of the day, when you're in charge of directing an entire nation on how to behave in order to keep some sort of social cohesion and social balance, it's fucking hard work.
At the very beginning, you talked about how your own internal journey and exploration has informed your outward work and service. And I'm wondering, what are the things, like what's the one or two things that you've learned and come to accept about yourself that have provided the greatest expansion and empathy or understanding in the way that you're describing it now? Internal lessons that have given you the most expansion of empathy or understanding externally?
If I can make mistakes, anybody can make mistakes, right? Like, there needs to be grace for the things that people have done. And you know, part of an extension of that is that you are not necessarily your past actions. You might have been a shitty partner to somebody once, and you might have, you know, cheated a business partner once. And if you've done the work to change and not be that person anymore, then you're not that person anymore. And like, to be able to see that people are who they are today and not necessarily just a sum of all the things they've done, which is hard. At the individual level, it's easier. And I get how it's hard when you're trying to elect somebody who has a history of, you know, potentially being a piece of shit. But at the individual level, in terms of finding empathy for individuals, it's like, I try to operate from a place where people are trying to be better versions of themselves all the time. I like to think that. And so that starting point helps uncover whether or not somebody actually is or isn't. Because if you start there, it's like the innocent until proven guilty. But like, if you prove yourself guilty, fine. Like, it is what it is. It's actually how I used to navigate a lot of really sticky situations with, especially in small town Canada and particularly small town Alberta, where they've never seen any of this before. And
points to face.
Oh, that's right. Points to face. And one of the things that I loved about that experience was people were very quick to let you know if they didn't like you, but you could start from a place where you assumed that they wanted to learn. And so you could get into the dialogue, and if it turned out that they were just like hateful people, you just walked away, right? You just moved on. I mean, there's a way to start from a place where it's like, you know what, this can be a really great interaction. And when I've started from that place by sort of assuming that people are just trying their best, right? They're not they're not anything other than the person they are in this moment. that I found very helpful. It took me a long time to learn that, but I found that to be really helpful. And I'm still not great at it, but it's been super helpful in the last few years. I think related to that as a second thing is, man, like we all have trauma. We all have trauma. Like, people are the way they are because of what they've experienced, how they've been nurtured, what they've been exposed to, whether it's, call it social conditioning or life event. But we're such a collection of the different types of grief and trauma that we've been through. And for me, right, looking myself in the mirror, it's like to not have empathy for people out of the gate would be a pretty shitty way for me to live. I'm not saying other people need to live that way, but for me, it's like, I think as I've been through more life events that have like really changed who I am as a person, to not have empathy for life events that might change other people's realities, like seems like a shitty place to start from, but that's just for me. So I think that's just helped, is knowing that, like, if I can go through these immense amounts of pain, or if I can go through these immense amounts of hurt, or these immense amounts of insecurity, or immense amounts of whatever, other people are probably going through the same shit.
Yeah.
And I wish there was a way to I'm sure there is a way. I mean, I haven't figured it out, but I wish there was a way to systemize that. Again, knowing what we know about psychological science, maybe it wouldn't work. But when we talk about positive politics, and we talk about, like, unfortunately, I don't know if there's a stat about this. I'd be very curious to see how many people have won their elections by exclusively platforming on positive politics. I don't know that it's possible in this day and age. Like, the cat's out of the bag, it feels like, on that. But I wish there was a way to sort of bring that, like, language of empathy in the campaign cycle.
There's a business for everything there's a market for. And unfortunately, sometimes we have to hit the floor before we bounce back up. And I think in many ways, these epochs of positive or negative orientation are cyclical. And if we're not on the floor, we got to be close.
I like to think so. Going back to, it's like the good old days weren't necessarily the good old days, called the Civil War or whatnot. And there's a part of me that asks, like, has it in fact always just been like this? It's just now we have so many more mediums and outlets and vehicles to see it.
Yes.
I sometimes think about how life was so much simpler when Canada only had 3 media outlets, because we all had to consume the same 3 opinions, and so we all had to form our opinions off of the same 3 sources of truth. And now anybody can be a media platform, which is amazing on one hand, and, like, potentially part of the problem on the other hand.
Yeah.
This is probably a conversation for a different day, but it even makes me wonder, what is this notion of truth? And, like, no, we need the truth. Like, to what degree is that actually part and parcel of the problem? Because of our, insatiable appetite to know the truth about all these things that we actually don't have a lot of control over. How much of that has contributed to how angry we all are at a societal level, because we don't have those same 3 sources of truth anymore, 7 sources. Like, we have 1.5 million sources of truth, whether it's, up here we got Rabble and the Tyee, they're both left-wing outlets, and then you got, like, Rebel on the right, and then you've got your mainstream, as you will, if you want to call them centrist, or down the middle. And when you've got all those options, like, not many of us are trying to read all the publications to sort of make our own opinions, or really most of us don't have the time.
I'm reminded that the last time we had such a major upheaval in the dissemination of information and the resulting question of what is true in the Western world, at least, was, Gutenberg and the invention of the printing press, which was immediately followed by the Crusades and centuries of war, which were really fought over, well, which book is true? And I think we're not in a dissimilar and more fractured moment now. I'm also reminded that period of war led to the longest sustained peace, the greatest quality of life behind the veil of ignorance for any human that's ever walked the earth. And hopefully our period of struggle will, through our own efforts, our own integrity, like you said, our own service, lead to a better future for the generations that come next and for the rest of this life that we get to live,
I have that hope, right? Like, I mean, through all of this tension and through all of this is like there are different ways to lead. There are different ways to pick up service. Yes. And those different ways can actually end up being great influencers to the people who hold the electoral seats. And that's, I think, where I ended up landing for myself as a person, which is I would rather influence electoral politics outside of the system itself.
Yeah.
Continuing to do the things that I do, perhaps with a bit more system or strategic thinking to be able to sort of hold a position. It's this idea that you can influence politics from outside the political system, and arguably in a more valuable way even than you could inside of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to take all of the above from all the different people serving in the best way for them, and hopefully those things are mutually reinforcing. I have a question that I like to ask everyone at the end of these. Our audience are not passive observers or not people on the sidelines. These are the proverbial humans in the arena. And as you've said, the arena has a lot of booby traps and a lot of threats and challenges these days. And so if you were to call on your own lived experience and isolate just one thing that you would want to leave them with, whether it's a practice, a thought, a mantra, an experience, anything at all that would best resource them to be a vector for the healing of our politics by starting with themselves, what do you think that thing would be?
That key phrase is there, right? Start with yourself. Keep yourself healthy. Keep yourself strong mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically. Find each other. You're not alone, right? There's so many people out there like you who are doing incredible, amazing things and are seeking to uplift each other and the systems and the communities in which they operate. Fundamentally, start at home and make sure that the work you're doing is authentically true to you. Because the systems need you, the communities need you, and the stronger you are, the stronger those communities will be.
Yeah, start at home. I love that. It is all connected. Japman, thank you so much. Japman, before we leave, anywhere that you would want our audience to get pointed to, whether that's an online account, a place to reach you, anything at all.
Yeah, sure. Listen, I just deactivated my Instagram, so you can't find me there anymore. But you can certainly look me up on LinkedIn. Love to connect there. The other thing is if you're interested in the work of more equitable workforce development, skills development, workforce participation, if you're doing work in that domain, I'd love to hear from you because I'm always interested to meet other innovators who are trying to make for a more just and equitable workforce and a more resilient one, because we're pretty up the creek without a paddle if we don't figure out that problem. So if you're working on finding ways for more people to participate in the workforce, I would love to hear from you.
Beautiful. Well, brother, have a beautiful day. Thank you so much for spending time with us here on Healing Our Politics. It has been really a pleasure.
Likewise, Skippy. Likewise. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to put what you've heard here today into practice, sign up for our newsletter, The Leader's Handbook, where each month you'll receive just one email with a curated selection of the most useful tools and practices discussed on this podcast today and over the course of the last month, delivered in simple how-to worksheets, videos, and audio guides, so you and your teams can try and test these out in your own life and see what best serves you. And lastly, if you want to be a vector for healing our politics, if you want to do your part, take out your phone right now and share this podcast with 5 colleagues you care about. Send a simple text, drop a line, and leave the ball in their court. Because the truth is, the more those around you do their work, the better it will show up in your life, in your community, and in your world. Have a beautiful day. The Healing Our Politics podcast is brought to you by the Elected Leaders Collective, the first leading and most highly recognized name in mental health, well-being, and performance coaching for elected leaders and public servants, designed specifically for you. Now, don't be fooled by the name. The Elected Leaders Collective is not just for elected leaders. It is for all public servants, staffers, volunteers, government, nonprofit, whole organizations. This is for you. If you are filled with passion for improving your community and world, but are tired, as I am, of the anger, stress, and vitriol If you find yourself banging your head against that same wall, struggling with the incoming criticism and threats, arguing with colleagues who are supposed to be on your team, and questioning if it's even worth it anymore, then the Elected Leaders Collective programming is specifically for you. With the Elected Leaders Collective, you will learn to become a hashtag political healer, building the authentic, unshakable confidence and courage to stay true to yourself through the anger and pressure, while cultivating the open, empathetic mind to meet others with the curiosity, compassion, and kindness necessary to respond to threats, improve challenging relationships, de-escalate conflict, and bring people in your community together to solve real problems and get shit done. You'll reduce stress, anxiety, and overwhelm and become a more effective leader while having time for your family, yourself, your health, and your wealth, sleeping well at night, and showing others they can too. Now that's leadership. Healing Our Politics listeners receive 10% off all Elected Leaders Collective services using the code hashtag political healer. Use it today and become one of the brave political leaders healing our politics. Use code hashtag political healer by going to www.electedleaderscollective.com and starting today. That's www.electedleaderscollective.com and starting today.